My name is Bruce. I survived the Afghanistan War. I came home alive. But when I finally crossed the street where I used to live, when I stopped in front of the door that once was mine, I realized something was wrong. I looked through the window, and that's when I understood. There was another man in my place. He was sitting at the table, laughing, having dinner with the woman I left behind when I went to war, living the life that should have been mine. In that moment, I understood something cruel. The war wasn't over for me. It had only changed its setting. Before continuing this story, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because to understand how everything reached this point, how I survived the war, but lost everything when I came home, we need to go back in time. Before the war, my life was quiet, not perfect, but quiet enough that I believed it would always stay that way. I was not a hero, not a man chasing glory. I was just someone trying to build a future with the person I loved. One ordinary day at a time. Our house wasn't big, but it felt solid. The walls held our laughter, our arguments, our silences. I remember how the front door sounded when it closed, the way the floor creaked near the kitchen, the smell of coffee in the mornings. Those details mattered to me, even if I didn't realize it back then. I thought those things were permanent, like gravity. I never imagined they could disappear. My wife and I met long before the word war became part of our daily conversations. We were young, still learning who we were, still believing that love alone could solve everything. She had a way of looking at me that made me feel chosen, as if out of everyone in the world, I was the one she trusted most. That look stayed with me for years. I carried it with me without knowing how fragile it really was. We talked about simple dreams, a stable job, a quiet life, maybe children one day. Nothing extraordinary, just enough. I worked long hours, came home tired, but satisfied. I liked knowing that someone was waiting for me. I liked the routine. It gave me a sense of purpose. At night, we would sit together, sometimes talking, sometimes saying nothing at all. Silence never felt uncomfortable back then. It felt safe. We were learning how to exist in the same space without needing to fill every moment with words. I thought that was what maturity looked like. The world outside our home felt distant. Conflicts happened on television screens, in headlines far away from our street. Afghanistan was a place I couldn't have pointed to on a map with confidence. War was something that happened to other people. People in uniforms, people with stories I would never be part of. I remember the first time the idea of leaving entered my mind. It didn't arrive loudly, it came quietly, disguised as responsibility. Conversations about duty, about doing something that mattered. I told myself it was temporary, a chapter, not the whole book. My wife didn't argue at first. She listened, she nodded, she asked questions that sounded supportive but carried fear underneath. I noticed it, but I ignored it. I convinced myself that love meant understanding sacrifice even when it hurt. The nights became heavier after that. Our conversations changed. They grew shorter, more careful. I could feel the tension even when neither of us said anything. It was as if we were both pretending not to see the crack forming between us. I promised her I would come back. I said it more than once, as if repetition could turn hope into certainty. I told her nothing would change, that we were strong, that this was just something we had to endure. She smiled when I said that, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. The closer the departure date came, the more I noticed things I had taken for granted. The way she folded my clothes, the way she rested her head on my shoulder, the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, there was love there, but also fear. And something else I didn't know how to name at the time. I wish I had asked more questions. I wish I had listened harder. But hindsight is cruel like that. It shows you the answers only after it's too late to use them. The night before I left, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid of the war, but because I was afraid of what distance might do to us. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing beside me, trying to memorize the sound. I didn't know I was doing that, but I was. In the morning, the house felt different, as if it already knew I was leaving. The air was heavier, the silence louder. We moved around each other carefully, avoiding eye contact for too long. When it was time to go, she hugged me tightly. Too tightly. "Come back to me," she said. "I will," I answered. At that moment, I believed it with everything I had. I walked out the door thinking I was stepping into a challenge. I had no idea I was stepping away from the life I thought was waiting for me. I didn't know that the version of me who left that morning would never fully return. That was my life before the war. Simple, fragile, and already slipping through my fingers without me realizing it. The decision to leave didn't arrive as a single moment. It was a slow accumulation of conversations, silences, and thoughts I kept to myself. It felt less like choosing and more like being carried by a current I didn't fully understand. I told myself it was practical, necessary, something responsible men did when life demanded more than comfort. At first, it was just information. News reports playing in the background. Names of places that felt distant and unreal. Afghanistan still sounded like a word from another world, heavy with dust and danger, but far removed from my own quiet street. I listened without listening, convinced that it would never truly intersect with my life. Then came the conversations. Friends talking about duty, about opportunity, about purpose. Words like honor and sacrifice floated through those talks, polished and clean, stripped of consequence. I nodded along, pretending I understood what they meant. Deep down, I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe that there was meaning waiting on the other side of fear. Money was mentioned to not greedily but practically. Stability, security, the idea that this decision could somehow protect the life we were building instead of threatening it. I clung to that thought more than I should have. It gave me a reason that sounded logical, something I could defend without admitting the fear underneath. When I finally told my wife that I was considering leaving, the room felt smaller. She didn't interrupt me. She let me speak until the words ran out, until I was left staring at the floor, waiting for her response. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. She asked me if I was sure. I said I wasn't, but I said it felt like the right thing to do. She asked me how long I would be gone. I told her what I had been told, months, maybe longer. I tried to sound confident, as if time was something that could be negotiated. She nodded again, the same way she always did when she was processing something painful, calm on the surface, distant underneath. I could see the questions she didn't ask. The fears she swallowed to keep the conversation from turning into an argument. That night, we lay in bed facing opposite directions. No words, no touching, just the quiet realization that something had shifted. I wanted to reach for her, to promise again that nothing would change, but the words felt thin even to me. In the days that followed, the idea of leaving became more real. Paperwork, appointments, lists, each step forward made turning back feel less possible. I told myself that doubt was normal, that everyone felt it. I didn't recognize it for what it really was. Instinct? I noticed how my wife started spending more time alone. How she lingered in rooms after I left them. How she looked at the house differently, as if memorizing it. We both pretended this was normal, that we were simply adjusting. I tried to be strong, tried to act like the man I thought I needed to be, the one who makes hard choices without hesitation, but strength, I would later learn, is often confused with silence. Friends congratulated me, told me I was brave, told me I would come back, changed, in a good way. I smiled and thanked them, feeling like I was already playing a role I didn't fully understand. No one asked what it would cost. As the departure date drew closer, the weight of the decision pressed harder against my chest. I woke up earlier, slept less, thought more. I found myself watching my wife when she didn't know it, studying her expressions, wondering if she was already preparing for a version of life without me. One evening, she finally asked the question I had been avoiding. What if you come back different? I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to say that I wouldn't, that love would protect us, that distance couldn't touch what we had. But none of that felt honest, so I said the only thing I could. We'll figure it out. She looked at me for a long time after that, not angry, not accusing, just tired. The night before my final paperwork was submitted, I sat alone in the living room, surrounded by the quiet evidence of the life I was about to leave behind. Photos on the wall, shoes by the door, a coffee mug still warm from the morning. All of it felt fragile in a way I had never noticed before. I realized then that the decision to leave wasn't just about going to war. It was about trusting that what I loved would wait for me. And that trust, once given, could not be taken back. In the end, I signed the papers. I told myself it was temporary, that love was patient, that time apart would only make us stronger. Those thoughts made it easier to breathe. But somewhere deep inside, a quieter voice warned me that some choices change things in ways you can't undo. I ignored it. I told myself fear was weakness. I told myself I was doing the right thing. When I told my wife it was official, she hugged me and said she understood. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled. I felt it, and for a brief moment, I almost told her I had changed my mind. Almost, that was the moment everything became real. Not when I left. Not when the plane took off. But when I chose not to listen to the doubt that was trying to protect me. The decision was made. And with it, the future I thought I was securing had already begun to slip away. Afghanistan did not announce itself with drama. There was no single moment where I stepped off a plane and felt transformed. Instead, it seeped into me slowly, through heat, dust, and a constant sense of alertness that never fully turned off. From the beginning, it was clear that this place operated on a different rhythm, one that did not care about comfort or familiarity. The air was heavy and dry, carrying a smell I couldn't immediately identify, a mix of sand, metal, and something burnt. The sun pressed down without mercy, draining energy even when I stood still. Every movement felt deliberate, calculated, as if wasting effort was a mistake you couldn't afford to make. I learned quickly that hesitation was dangerous, but so was rushing. Days blurred together. Wake up, gear on. Briefings that spoke in careful language, long stretches of waiting broken by sudden urgency. It wasn't the explosions that defined most of the time there. It was the anticipation of them, the silence before something happened. The way your body stayed tense even when nothing was happening at all. At night, the quiet felt different than it did back home. It wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. I lay awake listening to distant sounds, trying to decide which ones mattered and which ones were just part of the landscape. Sleep came in short fragments. When it did, it was shallow and easily disturbed. I started to notice changes in myself. Small at first, I reacted faster. I spoke less. I stopped thinking in long terms and focused only on what was directly in front of me. The future shrank. Plans beyond the next day felt unrealistic. Survival narrowed your world until there was room for nothing else. I thought about home often, but not in the way I expected. It wasn't constant longing. It was flashes. A memory of the kitchen, the sound of my wife's voice, the weight of her head on my shoulder. Those thoughts arrived without warning and left just as quickly, replaced by the immediate demands of where I was. Communication was limited. Calls were short, messages carefully filtered. I learned to choose my words, to avoid details that might worry her. I told her I was fine, because that was easier than explaining what fine meant in a place like this. She told me she was managing. I wanted to believe her. Time passed differently there. Weeks felt like months. Months felt like a single stretched out day. The routine became familiar, and that familiarity scared me more than the danger itself. I didn't want this place to feel normal, but part of me was adapting whether I liked it or not. I saw things I couldn't unsee. Not always violent, not always dramatic, but heavy. The faces of people who lived there, the way children watched us with expressions too old for their age. The destruction that blended into daily life as if it had always been that way. It forced a kind of emotional distance just to keep functioning. The event that would later define everything had not happened yet, but the groundwork was being laid. Fatigue built quietly. Stress accumulated in the background. Each day added another invisible weight to my shoulders. I didn't feel broken. I felt worn down, slowly and consistently. I stopped noticing the heat. I stopped reacting to loud noises the way I used to. That should have worried me, but it didn't. It felt like progress, like control. I didn't understand that numbness was not strength. It was protection, and it came at a cost. One afternoon, during a long stretch of waiting, I caught myself staring at nothing, lost in thought. I couldn't remember what day it was. That realization hit me harder than any physical threat. Time was slipping away, and I was letting it. I wondered what was changing back home, while I stayed frozen in this moment. I wondered if the life I left was still moving forward without me. Those thoughts were uncomfortable, so I pushed them aside. I told myself there would be time to deal with them later. The truth was, Afghanistan was reshaping me in ways I couldn't see yet. Not through heroics or moments of glory, but through repetition, through endurance. Through the constant need to stay alert while pretending everything was normal. By the time I realized how much I had changed, it already felt irreversible. I was becoming someone who belonged here more than I wanted to admit. And the distance between who I was and who I used to be was growing wider with every passing day. I didn't know it then, but this slow transformation was setting the stage for everything that would come next. The war was no longer just around me, it was inside me, and it was quietly preparing me for a loss I couldn't yet imagine. There is always a moment when things stop feeling manageable. It doesn't arrive with a warning, and it doesn't announce itself as the point that will change everything. At the time, it feels like just another day layered on top of many others. Only later do you realize that this was the moment your life split into a before and an after. That day started like most days in Afghanistan. The same heat, the same dust clinging to everything, the same quiet tension that never fully left your body. I went through the routine without thinking. Gear checks. Brief instructions delivered in calm voices that masked how quickly everything could turn. Nothing felt unusual enough to raise alarm. We were moving through an area that had become familiar. Familiar enough to lower your guard just a little. And that was always the danger. Familiarity created the illusion of safety, and illusions were deadly in a place like this. I remember noticing how still everything felt. Too still. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I remember thinking about how strange it was that my mind wandered in that moment, drifting to thoughts of home, of ordinary things, a table, a chair, a normal afternoon somewhere far away from this landscape. Then everything collapsed at once. The sound came first. Not loud, not cinematic, just sudden. A sharp rupture in the air that knocked the breath out of my chest before I fully understood what was happening. The ground shook beneath my feet, and for a split second, my body froze between instinct and confusion. Training took over before thought could catch up. I moved without deciding to move. My heart hammered so hard, it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. Noise filled everything. Shouting, static, the heavy thud of movement around me. Time fractured into pieces that refused to line up properly. I don't remember every detail clearly. Some moments are sharp, burned into my memory. Others are blurred, smeared together by adrenaline and fear. I remember the weight of my gear suddenly feeling unbearable. I remember the taste of dust in my mouth. I remember thinking, very calmly, that this might be how it ends. There was a choice that had to be made. A split-second decision that carried consequences no matter which direction it went. I won't dress it up as bravery. It wasn't heroic. It was desperate. It was the instinct to survive clashing with the responsibility to others. I moved toward the sound without fully understanding why. Maybe it was training. Maybe it was reflex. Maybe it was guilt. Even before there was something to feel guilty about. I remember seeing someone on the ground. I remember realizing, with a cold clarity, that not everyone would be leaving this place the way they arrived. The chaos didn't last long. It never does. Violence is brief. Its aftermath is what lingers. When things finally went quiet again, the silence felt wrong, heavy. Accusatory pressed down on everything, forcing reality back into focus. I stood there, breathing hard, hands shaking, trying to process what had just happened. My body was intact. No obvious injuries. That fact felt unreal, unfair around me. The evidence of the moment spread out in fragments I didn't want to look at too closely. That was when the guilt arrived. It didn't come as panic or grief. It came as a quiet, corrosive certainty. The understanding that surviving had not been free, that someone else had paid a price for the fact that I was still standing. I replayed the moment again and again in my head, searching for a different outcome, a different decision, something that could have changed what had already happened. There was no answer. From that day on, something inside me shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally. The part of me that believed I could endure anything without consequence disappeared. In its place grew a constant awareness of how fragile everything really was. Sleep became harder after that. When I closed my eyes, the moment replayed itself, slightly altered each time, as if my mind was trying to rewrite reality. I woke up tense, exhausted, already bracing for the day ahead. I stopped talking about the future altogether. It felt arrogant to plan when survival itself felt borrowed. I focused on getting through each hour, each task, each breath. Anything beyond that felt unnecessary. The war had finally done what it had been quietly preparing to do all along. It had broken the illusion that I was in control. It stripped away the belief that effort alone could protect what mattered most. I carried on because there was no alternative. I did my job, I followed orders, I survived. But the version of me who believed he could leave this place unchanged was gone. That moment followed me everywhere after that, in the quiet, in the noise, in the spaces between thoughts. It became a shadow I couldn't outrun. And, without realizing it, I began the slow process of retreating inward, pulling away from the world, preparing myself unconsciously for a loss that was still waiting for me on the other side of the war. Coming back alive was supposed to feel like relief. That's what everyone said. They talked about home as if it were a reset button, a place where everything broken could simply be put back the way it was. I believed that too, or at least I wanted to. It was easier than admitting how uncertain I felt about the person I had become. The journey back felt unreal. Airports, planes, waiting rooms, ordinary places filled with people going about their lives, unaware of how foreign they felt to me. Conversations sounded distant, like they were happening underwater. I watched families reunite, smiles wide, arms wrapped tightly around each other, and I wondered if that moment would fix something inside me. When I finally stepped off the last flight, the air felt different, softer, cleaner. I took a deep breath and told myself, this was it, I was home. Whatever I had lost in Afghanistan, I would find again here. The drive back to my neighborhood was quiet. Familiar streets passed by the window, but they didn't trigger the comfort I expected. Instead, they felt like memories I wasn't sure I belonged to anymore. I noticed details I had never paid attention to before. New paint on a fence. A car parked where there hadn't been one before. Small changes that hinted at time moving forward without me. When the car stopped in front of my house, my heart began to race. Not with excitement, but with something closer to apprehension. The house looked the same from the outside. Same structure, same roof, same door, but it didn't feel like it was waiting for me. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, my hand hovering near the door handle. I told myself I was just tired. That jet lag was playing tricks on my head. Still, something held me back. A quiet resistance I couldn't explain. I stepped inside. The smell was different, subtle but unmistakable. A scent that didn't belong to me. Furniture sat in familiar places, but it felt rearranged somehow, as if the room had been adapted to someone else's habits. I told myself I was imagining things, that after everything I'd been through, of course home would feel strange. My wife wasn't there yet. That surprised me. I had expected a moment, some kind of reunion that would make the distance worth it. Instead, I was alone in the space I used to call mine, unsure of where to put my bag, unsure of where I fit. I walked through the rooms slowly. Each one felt like a test. The bedroom, the kitchen, the living room. Objects were where they should be, but they didn't feel like mine anymore. It was as if I were visiting a carefully maintained replica of my own life. When my wife finally arrived, her reaction wasn't what I had imagined. She smiled, but it was hesitant. She hugged me, but her body felt tense, unfamiliar in my arms. We stood there awkwardly, holding each other without really connecting. She asked if I was tired, if I needed anything. Her words were kind, but distant, like she was speaking to someone she hadn't fully adjusted to yet. I told myself that time would fix this, that we just needed to relearn each other. That night, lying in our bed, sleep refused to come. The ceiling felt too close, the silence too loud. I listened to her breathing and realized it didn't sync with mine anymore. We had fallen out of rhythm. The days that followed didn't bring the relief I expected. Instead of settling in, I felt like an intruder in my own home. Conversations felt forced. Eye contact lingered too briefly. She moved around the house with a confidence that made it clear she had built a routine without me. Friends came by to congratulate me, to welcome me back. They asked questions I didn't know how to answer. They wanted stories, proof of bravery, something inspiring. I gave them vague responses, smiling when expected, nodding when appropriate. Inside, I felt disconnected, as if I were observing myself from a distance. I tried to convince myself this was normal. That adjustment took time. That, after everything, of course it wouldn't be easy, but the unease followed me everywhere. It settled into my chest and refused to leave. I started noticing gaps in my wife's stories. Moments she skipped over too quickly. Decisions that had been made without my input. I told myself not to read into it. I didn't want to be suspicious. I wanted to believe in the life I had left behind. But belief requires familiarity, and familiarity was slipping through my fingers. At night, I lay awake thinking about the war, about the moment everything broke, about how survival had cost me pieces of myself. I wondered if that was the reason things felt wrong. If maybe I was the one who no longer fit. I had come back alive, but I wasn't whole. And as the days passed, a quiet realization began to form. One I wasn't ready to face yet. Surviving the war had brought me home. But being home didn't mean I had returned to my life. Something had shifted while I was gone. Something irreversible. And I was only just beginning to sense how deep that change went. At first, I tried to ignore the feeling. I told myself it was just part of coming back, part of adjusting after everything I had been through. Trauma had a way of distorting perception, or at least that's what I had been told. So, when the unease settled into my chest and refused to leave, I blamed myself before I blamed anything else. But the signs were there, quiet and persistent. It started with small things so minor they were easy to dismiss. A drawer that no longer held my belongings, a mug I didn't recognize in the cabinet, a jacket hanging by the door that wasn't mine. Each detail on its own meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern I wasn't ready to acknowledge. My wife moved through the house with a confidence that felt new. She knew where everything was without thinking. She reached for items I would have had to search for. The house responded to her, not to me. I felt like a guest learning the rules of someone else's space. When I asked questions, she answered them easily, too easily. Her explanations were smooth, practiced. She didn't hesitate or stumble over her words. That should have reassured me, but instead it made my stomach tighten. It felt like she had rehearsed these moments long before I arrived. Conversations that used to flow naturally now felt guarded. She chose her words carefully, as if navigating around something fragile. When silence fell between us, it no longer felt comfortable. It felt deliberate, avoidant, as though there were thoughts she was keeping from me, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. I noticed changes in routines, meals prepared differently, grocery items I didn't remember buying. Even the way the house smelled had shifted. None of it was dramatic. None of it demanded confrontation. That was what made it worse. It was subtle enough to make me question my own instincts. I tried to ground myself. I reminded myself that time had passed, that people adapt, that expecting everything to be exactly the same was unrealistic. I told myself that my discomfort was proof that I was still adjusting, not evidence of something deeper. But the feeling didn't fade. It sharpened. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the living room, staring at a photograph on the shelf. It was a picture of us, taken years earlier. We were smiling, relaxed, unaware of how temporary that moment would be. I studied it, trying to remember when it had last been moved. I couldn't. That realization unsettled me more than I expected. Memory, I was learning, was unreliable. And when memory failed, doubt filled the space it left behind. I began paying closer attention, not intentionally at first, but instinctively. The way my wife checked her phone and then set it face down, the way she left the room to take certain calls, the way her tone changed when certain names came up in conversation. None of it was proof, but it was enough to keep me awake at night. When I tried to talk about how I was feeling, she reassured me quickly. She reminded me of everything I had been through. She suggested I was overwhelmed, exhausted, still carrying the war with me. Her concern sounded genuine, and that made it harder to argue. I started questioning myself. Maybe I was seeing threats where none existed. Maybe the war had trained me to look for danger even when I was safe. That idea made sense, and I hated how easily it explained everything. But even as I accepted that explanation, the discomfort remained. I noticed how little she spoke about the months I had been gone. When I asked about her routine, her days, her nights, she kept things vague. She spoke in generalities: work, home, friends, nothing specific, nothing personal. The house felt occupied in a way I couldn't define. Not crowded, but lived in. As if someone else's presence had left an imprint that hadn't yet faded. I felt it in the silence, in the air, in the way certain spaces no longer felt like mine. At times, I wondered if this was the price of survival, if coming back meant accepting that I no longer fit into the life I had left, that perhaps the problem wasn't the house or my wife, but me. That thought frightened me more than anything else. I began withdrawing without meaning to, spending more time alone, sitting quietly, observing, replaying conversations in my head. I searched for certainty in a place where none existed. The war had taught me to trust patterns, to recognize when something was off, even if I couldn't explain why. That instinct had kept me alive. And now, back home, it was telling me the same thing. Something was wrong. I didn't know what it was yet. I didn't know how deep it went. But I could feel it pressing closer, demanding to be seen. And no matter how much I wanted to believe otherwise, I knew that whatever was waiting beneath the surface would change everything once it came into the light. I didn't discover the truth all at once. It revealed itself slowly, the way painful things often do, piece by piece, until denial was no longer an option. By then, the damage had already been done. What I felt wasn't shock, it was confirmation. A quiet, devastating confirmation of something my instincts had been warning me about for weeks. The first moment came by accident. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't spying or searching through drawers. I was simply moving through the house, trying to convince myself that I still belonged there. That was when I noticed a pair of shoes by the door, not visitors' shoes, not something temporary. They were placed casually, confidently, as if they had earned their spot. They weren't mine. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at them as if they might rearrange themselves into something familiar. My chest tightened. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. A friend, a favor, a mistake. But none of those explanations fit the feeling that settled over me. When my wife came into the room, she noticed where my eyes were fixed. She hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "They're friends," she said quickly. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't ask which friend. I didn't ask why they were there. I had learned in Afghanistan that sometimes silence reveals more than questions. And her silence lingered longer than her explanation. After that, the signs became impossible to ignore. A jacket hanging in the closet that wasn't my size. A scent on the couch that didn't belong to either of us. The subtle rearrangement of space to accommodate someone else's habits. Everything pointed in the same direction. I started replaying past conversations in my head, looking for the moments I had missed, the vague answers, the deflections, the way she framed everything around my trauma, my adjustment, my fragility. It wasn't cruelty, it was strategy, a way to keep me doubting myself while the truth waited patiently in the background. The realization didn't make me angry right away. It made me hollow, as if something essential had been removed without my consent. I walked through the house feeling lighter and heavier at the same time, detached from everything around me. One evening, I came home earlier than expected. The house was quiet, too quiet. I moved slowly, not wanting to announce myself. That was when I heard laughter. Not mine, not hers alone. A shared sound, intimate and unguarded. I stopped moving. I stood there, heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to leave, to pretend I had never heard it. But my feet carried me forward anyway, guided by something deeper than fear. I saw them together, not doing anything dramatic, just existing in the same space with ease. Sitting close, comfortable, familiar, the way do people look when they no longer feel the need to explain themselves? He looked at home. I don't remember what my wife said when she noticed me. I don't remember the exact words. I remember the look on her face. The shift from surprise to resignation. The understanding that the truth no longer had anywhere to hide. That was the moment it became undeniable. There was another man in my place. Not visiting, not temporary. He had stepped into the life I left behind and filled the space I once occupied. He knew the routines, the house, the rhythm of her days, things I was still struggling to relearn. I didn't shout, I didn't accuse, I didn't collapse. I felt strangely calm, as if my body had already processed the worst of it before my mind caught up. The war had taught me how to endure unbearable moments by going still. My wife tried to explain. She spoke quickly, words tumbling over each other, loneliness, distance, time. She said she hadn't planned for it to happen, that it just did. That life had moved forward while I was gone. I listened without interrupting. Each word felt heavy, but none of them surprised me. They confirmed what I already knew. I looked at the man standing there, uncertain, uncomfortable, unsure of where he fit. Now that the illusion had broken, I didn't hate him. That realization confused me. I should have felt rage. Instead, I felt replaced. That feeling hurt more than anger ever could. I understood then that this wasn't just about betrayal. It was about absence, about the way time creates openings that someone else can step into. I had left, believing love would hold my place. I hadn't considered that love also needs presence. The war had taken pieces of me, but this moment took something different. It took my sense of belonging, my certainty that I had a place to return to. I stepped back, creating distance between myself and the life unfolding in front of me. I didn't know what came next. I only knew that the version of home I had been searching for no longer existed. There was another man in my place. And nothing I said or did in that moment could change that reality. The confrontation didn't unfold the way people imagine when they hear stories like this. There was no shouting, no dramatic gestures, no moment that felt satisfying or cinematic. What happened instead was quieter, heavier, and far more painful than anger could have been. We sat down at the table where I had once imagined growing old. The same table where plans had been made, where ordinary meals had been shared. Now it felt like neutral ground, stripped of memory, reduced to a place where the truth had nowhere left to hide. My wife spoke first. She said my name softly, as if volume alone could change what was happening. She told me she never intended for things to end this way, that she waited as long as she could. That loneliness has a way of distorting judgment, especially when time stretches on without answers. I listened. I kept my hands folded in front of me so she wouldn't see them shaking. The calm I felt earlier had begun to fracture, replaced by a slow-burning ache that spread through my chest. I wanted to interrupt her, to ask questions that demanded clear answers, but I stayed quiet. Part of me was afraid of what those answers might confirm. She talked about the months I was gone, about nights spent alone, about fear that something had happened to me, fear that never fully went away. She said she tried to stay strong, that she tried to believe I would come back the same. I wanted to tell her that I hadn't come back the same though, that the war had already taken something from me before she ever did. But that felt like an excuse, and I didn't want to hide behind it. She explained how it started slowly, conversations, shared moments, someone being there when I couldn't be. She said she didn't wake up one day and decide to replace me. It happened gradually, almost quietly, until suddenly it was real. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised me. It was steady. Too steady. I asked her when she knew. She hesitated. That pause was louder than any confession. She said she wasn't sure, that there was no exact moment, just a realization that life had changed and she had adapted to survive it. That word stayed with me, survive. I asked her if she ever thought about what it would feel like when I came home, if she imagined this moment. She looked away before answering. That told me everything I needed to know. She said she didn't think she would have to face it like this, that she thought there would be more time. That time had a way of softening things. I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because the idea felt absurd. Time hadn't softened anything. It had sharpened it. I asked her why she hadn't told me sooner, why she let me come back believing I still had a place. She said she didn't want to hurt me, that I had already been through enough. That hurt more than the truth itself. The conversation circled the same points again, and again, explanations, justifications, apologies that arrived too late to change anything. We spoke calmly, but the distance between us felt vast, like two people speaking different languages. At one point, she said something that broke whatever restraint I had left. She said she didn't know who I was anymore. I wanted to tell her that neither did I, that the man who left had died somewhere between fear and duty. That the one who came back was still trying to understand what remained, but instead, I said nothing. Silence felt more honest than any explanation. The man stood nearby, uncomfortable and unsure, as if waiting for permission to exist. I realized then that this confrontation wasn't just between my wife and me. It was between the life I thought I had and the reality standing in front of me. There was no resolution, no agreement, no moment where everything became clear. Just the understanding that something fundamental had ended. Eventually, the words ran out. We sat there, surrounded by the aftermath of honesty, listening to the quiet hum of a house that no longer felt like home. I stood up first, not dramatically, just quietly. I told her I needed time, that I couldn't make decisions in that moment. She nodded, tears in her eyes, but she didn't stop me. As I walked away from the table, I felt the weight of everything I had lost settle fully into my body. Not just my marriage, not just my home, but the belief that endurance alone could preserve what mattered. The confrontation didn't give me answers, it gave me clarity. And sometimes, clarity is the most painful thing of all. Losing everything didn't happen in a single moment. There was no dramatic collapse, no instant where my life shattered all at once. Instead, it unfolded slowly, through small realizations that accumulated until the weight became impossible to ignore. What I lost wasn't just my marriage or my home. It was the structure of who I believed I was. I left the house that night with only a few things, not because I had planned it that way, but because taking more felt pointless. Objects suddenly seemed meaningless, clothes, books, familiar items. None of them could anchor me to a place that no longer felt like mine. I walked out carrying a bag that felt lighter than it should have, as if it already knew it wasn't enough to hold what I was leaving behind. The street outside was quiet, the same street I had crossed countless times before. It looked unchanged, indifferent to what had just happened inside that house. That indifference hurt more than anger ever could. The world had not paused for my return. It had not waited for me to catch up. I drove without a destination in mind. The city felt unfamiliar, even though I knew every turn. Streetlights blurred past the windshield as my thoughts looped in circles I couldn't escape. I replayed the confrontation again and again, searching for something I could have said differently, something that might have changed the outcome. Each time, I reached the same conclusion. There was nothing left to fix. I stayed in places that felt temporary, rooms without history, beds that didn't know my weight. Every night, I lay awake listening to unfamiliar sounds, reminded that I was no longer part of the life I had once called home. The silence pressed in on me, heavy and constant. People reached out, friends, family. Their voices carried concern, confusion, sympathy. They asked questions I couldn't answer. They wanted explanations, details, something that made sense of what had happened. I gave them fragments. The truth felt too large to share all at once. Some suggested anger. Others suggested forgiveness. Most suggested time. None of those suggestions felt useful. Time had already done enough damage. Anger felt exhausting. Forgiveness felt premature. I began to understand that loss is not just about absence. It's about displacement. About realizing that the place you occupied no longer exists, and that there is no clear path back to it. I wasn't just grieving my marriage. I was grieving the version of myself that believed love alone could survive distance. The war had taught me how to endure physical danger. It had taught me how to stay alert, how to function under pressure, but it hadn't prepared me for this. For the slow erosion of identity that comes when the life you built continues without you. I questioned every decision I had made, not just the choice to leave, but the smaller ones. The moments I chose duty over presence, the times I assumed stability was guaranteed. I wondered if things would have been different if I had stayed, or if this outcome had been inevitable regardless. Those questions had no answers, and eventually, I learned that searching for them only deepened the pain. What surprised me most was the sense of invisibility. Without my role as a husband, without the structure of a shared life, I felt unanchored. Conversations felt awkward, plans felt provisional. I didn't know how to introduce myself anymore, or what version of my story to tell. I avoided places that reminded me of what I had lost. Restaurants we used to visit, streets we walked together. Even memories became something I had to navigate carefully. Too much reflection pulled me backward. Too little made me feel hollow. There were moments when I felt anger rise unexpectedly, not explosive, but sharp. directed not just at my wife or the man who took my place, but at myself. For believing that sacrifice would be rewarded, for assuming that endurance equaled permanence. I also felt guilt. Guilt for surviving when others hadn't, guilt for leaving, guilt for resenting the life that continued without me. Those emotions tangled together, creating a constant undercurrent I couldn't escape. At times, I wondered if this was the real cost of the war, not the memories, not the trauma, but the realization that while I had been fighting to survive, everything I valued had been learning how to live without me. I started to understand that survival and belonging are not the same thing. You can survive almost anything if you are forced to. Belonging, on the other hand, requires mutual presence. It requires choice. And sometimes, that choice is taken away without your consent. By the end of that period, I had lost more than a relationship. I had lost certainty, direction, the quiet confidence that comes from knowing where you fit in the world. I had been reduced to something raw, stripped of the labels that once defined me. And yet, beneath the exhaustion and grief, there was something else, a fragile awareness. The understanding that hitting bottom, while devastating, also removes illusions. When there is nothing left to lose, clarity becomes unavoidable. I didn't know what came next. I didn't have a plan. All I knew was that the life I had left behind was gone, and pretending otherwise would only prolong the pain. I had survived the war, but now, standing alone in the aftermath of my return, I was facing a different kind of battle. One without enemies or orders, one that required me to confront who I was without everything I thought defined me. Losing everything was not the end, but it was the moment I stopped lying to myself about what had truly been taken from me. I didn't rebuild my life overnight. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense, no dramatic turning point that erased what had happened. Healing, I learned, doesn't arrive with certainty. It arrives quietly, through small decisions made when no one is watching. At first, my days were simple. Wake up, move forward. Avoid looking back too long. I focused on what I could control because everything else felt too fragile to touch. I stopped asking questions that had no answers. I stopped imagining alternate versions of my life where I stayed, where things turned out differently. Those thoughts only reopened wounds that had begun, slowly, to close. I found myself drawn to silence. Not the heavy silence of loss, but a calmer one. The kind that allows space for reflection without punishment. I spent long hours walking, letting my thoughts rise and fall without trying to trap them. I listened to my own breathing, to the steady rhythm that reminded me I was still here. People asked me what I planned to do next. I didn't know how to answer. For so long, my identity had been shaped by roles: soldier, husband, provider. When those were stripped away, I was left with a question I had never learned how to ask. Who am I without them? The answer didn't come quickly. It arrived in fragments. In moments where I noticed myself reacting differently to things that once triggered anger or fear, in conversations where I spoke honestly instead of defensively, in the realization that I no longer needed to justify my pain to anyone, I began to understand that surviving the war wasn't the most important part of my story. Many people survive. What matters is what you do afterward, when survival no longer demands your full attention and you're left alone with what remains. I thought often about the man I was before I left, the certainty he carried, the belief that sacrifice was always rewarded, that love was immune to distance. I don't judge him anymore. He did the best he could with the understanding he had at the time, but I am not him now. The war taught me how fragile the body is. Coming home taught me how fragile life can be even when the body survives. Together, they forced me to confront a truth I had spent years avoiding. Nothing stays in place just because you expect it to. People change, circumstances shift, time moves forward whether you're present or not. Believing otherwise doesn't make you loyal, it makes you unprepared. That realization hurt, but it also freed me. I stopped seeing myself as someone who had been replaced and started seeing myself as someone who had been released. Released from a life that could no longer grow. Released from expectations that were built on assumptions instead of reality. I didn't forgive easily. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't a single act, it's a process. Some days I felt closer to it. Other days, the weight returned. I allowed that fluctuation without judgment. Healing isn't linear, and pretending it is only creates new wounds. I rebuilt my life slowly, not by trying to recreate what I had lost, but by allowing something new to take shape. I learned to be present in ways I hadn't before, to listen instead of assuming, to value time not as something guaranteed, but as something shared. The war taught me discipline. Loss taught me humility. Together, they reshaped my understanding of strength. Strength is not enduring everything without breaking. Strength is recognizing when something has already broken and choosing to build again anyway. I don't regret surviving. I don't regret coming home. I even resist the urge to regret leaving, because regret implies certainty, and life rarely offers that. What I regret is believing that absence has no cost. It does. Sometimes that cost is paid quietly, while you are far away, believing you are protecting what matters most. I learned that love does not exist in promises alone. It exists in presence. In shared moments, in the ordinary days we assume will always be there. When those days disappear, they don't announce their departure. They simply stop waiting. That is the lesson I carry with me now. I survived the war, but survival was only the beginning. The real test came after, when I had to face the truth that not every battle is fought with weapons, and not every loss comes from the enemy. Some losses come from time, some come from distance, and some come from believing that what you leave behind will remain untouched exactly as you remember it. If there is one thing my story taught me, it is this. Survival keeps you alive. Presence gives your life meaning. And when the two are separated for too long, something important is always at risk of being lost. That is the lesson I learned when I came home.